HarperCollins presents The Cottage by Lisa Stone. Read by Jess Whittaker. Chapter 1. There was something outside. Jan was sure of it, just as she'd been sure the evening before. The living room curtains were closed against the night sky, but on the other side of the window lay a small patio, and there was something lurking out there. She hadn't seen or heard it, but the dog on her lap certainly had. Tinder had been asleep. Then his ears had pricked up as he'd raised his head. He was now staring at the curtain and growling, his pupils enlarged to black orbs. His behaviour was unsettling her even more. Jan knew a dog's heightened sense of smell and hearing gave it an advantage over humans, so Tinder could smell and hear things she could not. There was something out there, and the dog knew, something alive, ominous, and threatening. It had begun 4 nights ago. Jan had been sitting on the sofa in front of the television with Tinder on her lap, as they'd got into the habit of doing most nights. She stroked his soft, wavy fur, and he slept peacefully. Then suddenly, he was awake, on guard, making her start and a little bit afraid. Now it was happening again. There was just her and Tinder in the cottage, which was situated on the edge of Coleshaw Woods. With her senses tingling and not taking her eyes from Tinder, Jan picked up the remote control and muted the television. She listened, straining into the silence. But there was nothing. No noise in or outside the cottage. Outside the air was still. It was a chilly but calm autumn night. Tinder was still on guard, staring menacingly at the curtains, ready to attack if necessary. "It's okay," Jan said quietly, stroking his back. "There's nothing to be afraid of." She felt she'd said it more for her own benefit than the dog's, although she wasn't reassured any more than Tinder appeared to be. She continued to stroke his velvety fur, hoping he would return to sleep. He was only small, a lapdog, and if he settled then so would she, for it would mean that whatever was out there had gone and the danger had passed. She'd never thought of herself as a dog lover before moving into Ivy Cottage, but Tinder had come with the cottage, and she found him rather cute. He was a Bichon Frise cross, and looked like a little teddy bear with his button nose and light brown fur. He was part of the tenancy agreement, a welcome one as it had turned out, or Jan would have been lonely. She had taken a 6-month let on the cottage at a very low rent, in exchange for looking after the cottage and Tinder while the owner Camille worked abroad. Jan had scarcely believed her good luck when the offer had arrived. It had come at exactly the right time and was just what she needed. She had been made redundant from her job in retail management after a restructuring program to save the company money. She had started with them as a trainee on leaving college and had assumed it was a job for life, but she had received 1 month's notice with the other employees they were letting go. Then, 2 days later, her long-term boyfriend Danny, whom she'd been living with for 5 years, had announced he wasn't ready for commitment yet and asked her to move out. "It's not your fault. I just need my own space," he'd said. "It took you long enough to figure that out," she'd snapped, fighting back tears. Devastated and with her life in ruins, Jan had packed and moved in temporarily with her parents, storing the boxes of her belongings in their garage. 30 years old next year, with no job and having been heartlessly dumped, Jan was at an all-time low. But then, while searching jobs and accommodation on the internet, she'd come across the advertisement for Ivy Cottage. It seemed like fate, as if it was meant to be. A ridiculously low rent and a complete change of scene. It would give her time to recharge her batteries and think about what she wanted to do next and with the rest of her life. She might even find the inspiration to start that book she'd been meaning to write. "Are you sure it's what you want?" her mother had asked anxiously as she told her of her plans. "The cottage sounds very isolated, and you'll be living there all alone." "I'm sure, and I'll have the dog to keep me company," Jan had replied with a reassuring smile. But it was at moments like this when she had doubts and thought her mother may have been right. Living on the edge of Coleshaw Woods was very different to living on the edge of a town or city. Here there were noises at night she wasn't accustomed to, and then deafening silence, the like of which you never got in the town. The cottage creaked with its own sounds, and sometimes the wind whistled through the woods as though the trees were talking, whispering between themselves. But she'd made the decision, signed the agreement, and wouldn't let the owner down. By daylight, the woods and countryside were very different, appealing. The air smelt fresher than in the town, and the country walks she went on with Tinder were invigorating. She had the time alone she needed to take stock and consider her future, wherever that might be. It was when darkness fell that the atmosphere dramatically changed, and she would have welcomed some company. But who was going to journey out here in winter? Her parents and friends worked, and it would mean them staying the weekend as it was too far for a day trip. She appreciated that they had their own lives and commitments, and she didn't want to sound needy. It was a pity the let had been for the winter months, she thought, with the nights closing in earlier and earlier. Now the end of October, it was dark by 5 o'clock, even earlier if it had been overcast. A summer let would have been far more attractive. Jan glanced at her phone. It was just gone 8 o'clock, the same time it had happened the previous nights. But whatever was outside must have gone, for Tinder had lost interest. As she stroked him, his eyes gradually closed and his head slowly relaxed until it was resting on her leg again. She liked Tinder very much, and she had decided that when she left the cottage in 5 months' time and found a place of her own to live, she'd have a small dog or cat. Or was that a cliché? A singleton and her pet in a flat. Only Tinder's ears remained alert, twitching every so often as if part of him was listening while the rest of his body slept. Jan had noticed this before, that when he was sleeping his ears seemed to stay awake. Was he actually listening, she wondered, or was it instinct left over from evolution, when dogs had been wolves before a line had become domesticated? At a time when his ancestors had been wild and feral, catching prey but also liable to be preyed upon by bigger predators, they'd had to remain alert, even when sleeping if they weren't to be eaten. "Tinder," she said softly, caressing the fur on his neck. A moment passed. Then he was suddenly awake, head up and wide-eyed. Not from her voice, but from whatever was outside again. A chill ran up her spine. It was back, and Tinder's hackles were rising. Her heart began to beat faster. He was staring at the curtain, ready to attack. Without warning, he jumped from her lap onto the back of the sofa and, barking furiously, pawed the curtain to be let out. "Get down," Jan said, picking him up. He would damage the curtain. He struggled to be put down, then raced to the back door in the kitchen, where he began scuffing the floor in his frenzy to be let out, the same as he had the nights before when he'd heard something. "No, bad boy," Jan said, going into the kitchen. The previous night, he hadn't come back for 2 hours, and she'd been worried sick, thinking he was lost for good and she'd have to tell Camille. When he'd come back, he'd looked as though he'd learnt his lesson, and had been very pleased to see her, almost as if he'd had a nasty escape. But from what? A fox? Rats? A badger? Coming from the town, she had little idea. He was frantically pawing the door and still barking. Jan had no choice but to let him out if he wasn't to do damage. As soon as she opened the back door, he shot down the garden. It was a cold night, with a faint crescent moon in a clear black sky. She could see Tinder at the very bottom of the garden, having chased something into the shrubbery, something quite large that had quickly disappeared. Then he too disappeared, following it into the bushes that separated the garden from the woods. "Shit!" Jan cursed. "Tinder, come back now!" she shouted. "Tinder!" But he'd gone. "Tinder!" Silence. She stood at the back door for a moment, listening, and then closed and locked it, hoping Tinder would return soon. She'd caught a glimpse of what was out there, a shadowy outline, before it had disappeared through the hedge. The previous nights, she hadn't seen a thing. It was bigger than a fox or badger, though, and not that shape. Perhaps there were animals living in the woods that, as a townie, she wasn't familiar with, and yet... She shivered and moved away from the back door. In the second before it had disappeared, she could have sworn that instead of running on all fours as an animal would have done, it had stood on 2 legs, as if human. Surely not. Chapter 2. But it wasn't big enough to be a person, Jan thought as she stood by the heater in the kitchen trying to get warm. And something in the way it had moved, its agility, said it was an animal, although she hadn't had much of a look. She needed to get a grip. Of course it would be an animal living in Coleshaw Woods. Pity she didn't have Tinder's fearlessness to follow it. She hoped he came back soon. Checking she'd locked the back door, Jan made herself a mug of tea, then fed the electricity meter that was in the cupboard under the stairs. It was an old-style coin-operated meter that required pound coins to keep the power on. Camille had left instructions on this and other matters connected with the running of the cottage, and also some coins to keep Jan going until she had her own supply, which was thoughtful. However, not in the habit of having to feed a meter and failing to realise how quickly some appliances devoured electricity, the day after she'd moved in, she'd been showering when all the lights had gone off and the shower had stopped working. Naked, wet, and unnerved, she'd groped her way downstairs to the hall where the torch hung on a hook. She had gingerly followed the torch beam to the cupboard under the stairs and fed the meter. Now she checked it regularly to make sure it didn't happen again. Being plunged into darkness had spooked her. Reassured the meter was topped up, Jan took her mug of tea into the living room, sat on the sofa, and listening out for Tinder's return, opened her laptop. Thank goodness the cottage had Wi-Fi and a mobile signal. It came from the local village, Merryless, so named because it had once had a merry-go-round that had been removed after a tragic accident that had resulted in a child's death. Apart from its sad history, the village was pretty but small, with a single grocery shop, a pub, and a church. Although it was only a mile from the cottage, it felt much further away at night. While Jan waited anxiously for Tinder to return, she decided she should put the time to good use and try to identify what was coming into the garden at night and causing her so much unease. If it had a name, it wouldn't seem so menacing, she reasoned. Taking a sip of her tea, she typed, "Large animals found in UK woods" into the search engine. Deer, badgers, beavers, foxes, wild boar, in some areas was the result. And Scottish wildcat, but she wasn't in Scotland. She tried again, narrowing the search, and typed in, "What large animals live in Coleshaw Woods?" The result showed foxes and badgers, and then lots of smaller animals, squirrels, mice, voles. These were far too small. What she'd seen was much bigger. Perhaps the animal wasn't indigenous to these parts, but had escaped from a zoo or a private collection. She typed, "What animals can walk upright?" into the search engine. A page came up with photographs of primates walking on their back legs. Kangaroos, bears, and some lizards, she also learnt, occasionally went biped. It certainly wasn't a lizard or a kangaroo. She supposed it could have been a small bear or a monkey, or was she getting carried away? Surely they wouldn't be able to survive in the woods. Unnerved and alone, her imagination was getting the better of her. Then a picture of a fox leaping over a fence appeared on the web page, and it looked familiar. As it stretched up into its leap, it was standing on its hind legs. Yes, of course, that was the most likely explanation. The dark shadow she'd seen was a leaping fox. If it came to the cottage again tomorrow, she'd be braver and go outside for a closer look. Jan closed the web page and was about to reply to an email when something hard hit the window. She jumped. What the hell? With her heart thumping wildly, she scrambled off the sofa, away from the window, and stared at the curtains, petrified, waiting for another sound. Silence. Then she heard Tinder's bark at the back door. Thank goodness. He was back. Had the noise been him? She rushed to let him in, then quickly closed and relocked the door. Good boy, she said, kneeling to pet him. You're safe. As on the previous nights, he was very pleased to see her, although he hadn't been away for long. He rubbed against her and licked her hands. What was it? A fox? She asked him. Tinder stared back uncomprehendingly. Then she saw it. What looked like a flake of food lodged in the fur by his mouth. She picked it off and smelt it. It was cooked meat, possibly sausage. But she hadn't given him meat to eat. He had dry dog food and only that. Camille had been most specific in her instructions that this was the only food Tinder was allowed, as it gave him a properly balanced diet. She'd left a dozen large sealed bags of dry food in the cupboard under the stairs, more than enough for 6 months. 1 scoop in the morning and 1 at 5 o'clock, she'd written, no tidbits or leftovers, as they were bad for him. Jan had followed her instructions exactly, so where had Tinder got cooked meat from? Straightening, she glanced around. Not from the kitchen. The only meat was what Camille had left in the freezer. A dustbin? But there was only her bin out here, collected once a week, and it was supposed to be animal-proof. Added to which, she hadn't eaten meat. She was mostly vegetarian, occasionally eating fish, but that was all. It crossed her mind that Tinder might have got the meat from another bin, but she dismissed that idea. He hadn't been gone long enough to make it to the village and back, and there were no other properties between Ivy Cottage and Merryless. Also, according to Camille, he never went that far. You can let him off the lead if you go for a walk, Camille had written in her notes. He won't stray far. But he had the night before. Could he have got the cooked meat from the woods? Jan wondered. Was someone camping there? It was possible, she supposed. A homeless person or army cadets on a training exercise. Could that be it? They'd fed him, or he'd found their leftovers, or he'd been caught stealing their meal and they'd chased him off. That would explain why he'd landed with such force against the window. She couldn't think of any other explanation, yet there'd been no sign of a camp when she'd walked in the woods in daylight. But then again, she'd kept to the paths and the woods stretched for miles. It was at its most dense behind the cottage, so someone could be living there. Come on, she said, returning to the sofa. No more disappearing. Chapter 3. Midwife Anne Long parked her Vauxhall Corsa outside 57 Booth Lane, switched off the car's headlights and cut the engine. She sat for a moment, staring straight ahead. Then, with a resigned sigh, got out. Going to the boot of her car, she took out what she needed. The rest of the equipment for the birth was already in the house. At 4 a.m, the air was cold and the street deserted. Virtually all the other houses were in darkness, but not so Ian and Emma Jennings. They were up, and had been all night, timing Emma's contractions and texting Anne until the contractions were 5 minutes apart and Anne had said she'd come. She walked stoically up the short path, worried and preoccupied, then pressed the doorbell. Usually a birth was a joyous occasion, but not this one. No one answered the door on the first ring, and Anne's sense of foreboding increased. She pressed the bell again. They certainly wouldn't be asleep. Had something gone wrong already? She prayed not. Ian and Emma were a lovely couple in their late 20s and were having a home birth after their dreadful experience in hospital the last time when they'd lost their first baby. Emma had readily agreed to a home birth. She didn't want to go near a hospital again, and Anne had overseen her pregnancy. The door finally opened, and Ian Jennings looked at her with weary acceptance. "Sorry, I was with Emma," he said, his voice flat. "Come in." He took the cylinder of Entonox from her. "Thank you. Emma's in bed. I've put the waterproof cover on the mattress like you said." "Good. How are you both?" Anne asked as she followed Ian upstairs. He shrugged dejectedly. It was a stupid question, she thought. Of course they were both scared stiff and just wanted it over with. "Shouldn't be too long now," she added. She went into the main bedroom. In contrast to the landing and hall, it was dimly lit. The centre light turned right down. Emma was just visible on the other side of the room, propped up on a mountain of pillows, her blonde hair recently cut short. "How you doing?" Anne asked gently, going over. "I'm scared," Emma said. "I know, love. I'll look after you." Then to Ian, "I'll need the light up while I examine Emma. You can turn it down again after." She appreciated they wouldn't want the room bright for long. The less they saw, the better, but she needed some light to do her job and deliver the baby. "Light, please, Ian," Anne said more firmly. He was standing in a daze, staring at his wife and still holding the cylinder of Entonox. "You can put that down there, please." As if in a trance, he placed the cylinder by the bed and then went to the light switch and raised the lights a little. "Right up, please, Ian," Anne said. Now she could see Emma's tired, worn, anxious face more clearly. Another contraction took hold and she grimaced in pain. "Do you want gas and air?" Anne asked. Emma nodded. Anne took the mask from its sealed package and attached it to the cylinder, then placed the mask in Emma's hand. She waited while she took a few breaths. Ian stood still and quiet somewhere behind her. "I can give you a shot of pethidine if you wish," she said to Emma. "It will be about 20 minutes before it takes effect." "Yes, please," Emma said, her voice small and strained. Anne opened her midwife's bag, prepared the injection, and then gave Emma the shot in her thigh. Normally she wouldn't have offered pethidine this close to the birth unless the mother really wasn't coping with the pain. It could cause the mother to become unresponsive and affect the baby's breathing and first feed. But that wasn't an issue here. Emma could have whatever she needed just to get through the ordeal. Now Emma was more comfortable. Anne took her pulse, blood pressure and temperature. They were all normal for a woman in the active stage of labour. Ian was standing passively to one side, not knowing what to do for the best. "Come and hold your wife's hand while I examine her," Anne told him. With over 20 years' experience as a midwife, Anne knew that the men often needed more support than the woman giving birth, even when the birth went to plan and was straightforward, which this wasn't. Taking a pair of sterile gloves from her bag, Anne went to the end of the bed and raised the sheet. She examined Emma internally and then covered her again. "It will be at least another 2 hours, if not longer," she said, peeling off her gloves. Ian sighed and rubbed his forehead in anguish. He wasn't doing Emma any favours, Anne thought. His nervousness was contagious. "Perhaps you could make me a cup of coffee?" she suggested. "I didn't have time for one before I left." He crossed the room towards the door and on his way out dimmed the lights. "It's better if he's occupied," Anne told Emma, and sat in the chair by her bed. Emma grimaced as another contraction took hold. Anne guided her hand to the mask, and Emma breathed in the gas and air. "You're doing well," Anne said reassuringly, rubbing her patient's arm. "The pethidine will take effect soon." "I just want it over with," Emma cried, a tear slipping down her cheek. "We won't try again for another child." "I know, love. Just stay calm and take deep breaths. I'm here with you." "You won't leave, will you?" Emma asked anxiously. "No, not until it's all over." Ian returned with the cup of coffee, then hovered, unsure of what to do next. "Have we got everything we need for the birth?" Anne asked him. "I think so," he replied, glancing around. Anne knew they had. While the light had been raised, she'd seen the pile of towels, blanket, Moses basket, maternity pads, bags for rubbish, and a plastic bucket. Compared to the equipment that filled some home birthing rooms, this was the absolute minimum. No candles, soft music, TENS machine, birthing pool, or piles of first-size baby clothes. They just had what was needed to get the baby out and gone. "It'll be a while yet," Anne said again, looking at Ian. "You can go if you've got something you want to do, and I'll call you when it's time." "I'll stay," he said, and sat in the chair on the other side of the bed. He took his wife's hand and pressed it to his cheek. Anne's heart went out to them. They didn't deserve this. Emma grimaced as another contraction took hold. Ian helped her keep the mask on her face as she breathed in the gas and air. Gradually the pethidine took effect, and the pain became more manageable. Now all they could do was wait and let nature take its course. Seated in the semi-darkness, Anne looked on as Ian held his wife's hand and passed her the mask each time she needed Entonox. She wasn't making much fuss, not really. The pethidine helped. The minutes ticked by as the contractions increased, and Anne stood and checked Emma's vital signs again. They were as they should be. But a few minutes later, Emma let out a piercing scream. "Raise the lights, please," she told Ian, standing. "I need to examine Emma." She quickly put on sterile gloves and lifted the bed cover. The baby was coming faster than she'd expected. The cervix was fully dilated. Emma screamed again. "Bring a towel, quickly," Anne called to Ian. "It's on its way." Ian rushed from his wife's side, brought back a towel and watched as Anne placed it beneath Emma, just in time. The baby's head appeared. Emma screamed again, her cry so chilling and intense it seemed to come from the depths of her being, as if she were being torn apart. "Push, love," Anne said. "Take a deep breath and push." Emma gulped in the air, gave a long, hard push and screamed as the baby tumbled out. "Well done." "Don't look, Ian," Anne said. But it was too late. He was still by her side, now staring at the baby, his expression a mixture of awe and horror. "Ian, go to your wife," Anne instructed. He remained where he was. "Ian, now," she said more firmly. "Emma needs you." He turned, dazed, and went to her side. Enfolding her in his arms, they both wept openly. Anne wiped the baby's face free of mucus, cut and clamped the umbilical cord, then carried it to where the towels were. Wiping its body, she wrapped it in a fresh towel and placed the bundle on its side in the Moses basket, facing away from them. "Is it alive?" Ian asked. "No," Anne said. "Boy or girl?" Emma asked between sobs. "Boy," Anne replied, "but you don't want to see it." Emma's sobs grew. Anne returned to her patient and concentrated on delivering the placenta as Ian and Emma comforted each other. She checked the placenta was all there and then disposed of it in one of the rubbish bags, firmly tying the top. She checked Emma's vital signs again. They were normal. Neither of them looked at the Moses basket on the far side of the room, where the infant remained quiet and motionless. Anne gathered together her equipment and returned it to her bag. "I'll come back for these later," she said to Ian, placing the cylinder and her midwife bag to one side. I expect Emma would like something to eat and drink now." Ian nodded dumbly. "I'll be as quick as I can." Leaving the couple to their grief, Anne crossed the room to the Moses basket. She covered the baby with a blanket and then picked up the basket. She looked at Ian and Emma clinging tightly to each other, consumed by grief. Her heart clenched, but there was nothing more she could do here, and she needed to go now. She dare not leave it any longer. She began towards the door. "Anne," Emma called through her tears. She paused. "Don't change your mind about seeing the baby," she thought. "Just let me go." "Yes?" she asked tentatively, keeping her back to the couple. "We called him David," Emma said. "It means loved." "I'll remember," Anne said, and continued out of the room, then carefully downstairs, the Moses basket at her side. She quietly let herself out of the front door. It was nearly 8 o'clock, and the households were on the move. Dog walkers and people beginning to leave the house for work. She pulled the blanket right over the baby's face and hurried to her car. Opening the rear door, she carefully placed the Moses basket on the back seat, uncovered the baby's face a little, and secured the basket with the seat belts. It wasn't ideal, but it would have to do. She closed the rear door and got into the driver's seat, then started the engine. As she did, a woman appeared at the upstairs window of the house next door. Anne went cold. Had she seen her leave with the Moses basket? It was possible, although she wouldn't have seen what was in it. When she returned to Ian and Emma's later, she'd make sure they had their story straight. One slip of the tongue, one small inconsistency, could be their undoing. Chapter 4. What the hell? Jan's eyes shot open. Panic gripped her. She stared across the room. Where was she? A small crack of light showed between the gap in the curtains. Those weren't her curtains. This wasn't her bedroom. She sat bolt upright in bed and stared around. Then she remembered. Of course this wasn't her bedroom. It was the bedroom in the cottage she was renting. Relief flooded through her. She rested her head back on the pillows and waited for her pulse to settle. Judging from the light outside, it was morning. But what time was it? She reached for her phone. It was 9:10, later than she normally woke, but she hadn't gone to sleep until very late. And then she'd been plagued by nightmares in which someone or something had been chasing her through Coleshaw Woods. Even now she was awake, she could remember the terror she'd felt as she'd run from the inescapable horror. She guessed it was hardly surprising she was sleeping badly after what had happened all week. Tinder was downstairs, shut in the kitchen, now waiting for his breakfast. Camille didn't allow him on her bed, but if Jan was honest, she would have found his company reassuring. A loud knock sounded on the front door, making her start. Someone was here at this time? It could have been the sound of the door knocker that had woken her with a start in the first place. Getting out of bed, Jan pushed her feet into her slippers. All the floors in the cottage were stripped wood, making going barefoot uncomfortable and cold. She put on her dressing gown and went to the small casement window that overlooked the front. Parting the curtains, she looked out. How much braver she felt now it was daylight. The autumn sun flickered between the trees. Looking down, she could see her car parked to the right of the cottage, but not the person at the front door, which was immediately beneath the window. She opened the window a little and called down, "Hello, who's there?" The visitor stepped back into her line of vision. "Oh, Chris, it's you. You gave me a shock. I was asleep." "Sorry. I thought you'd be awake by now on a glorious day like this." "I should be, but I had a bad night," Jan admitted. "Sorry to hear that." "I brought you some eggs," Chris said, holding up a box of eggs. He lived in Merryless and kept chickens. "Shall I leave them on the doorstep?" If you can wait while I put on some clothes, I'll make you a coffee, Jan offered. Chris usually came in for a coffee when he visited. Sounds good, thanks. Jan closed the window and began dressing. She had met Christopher, or Chris as he liked to be known, a few times since she'd moved in. A friend of Camille's, he called on her from time to time, ostensibly to check she had everything she needed. Jan suspected there was also an element of making sure she was looking after the cottage and Tinder, which she didn't have a problem with. After all, Camille had entrusted her home and dog to a complete stranger. Running a brush through her hair, Jan checked her face in the mirror. It would have to do. She liked Chris, but suspected he was more than just friends with Camille. Although he'd never said as much, she'd noticed a warmth creep into his voice whenever he spoke of her. But Jan liked his company and was grateful for it, especially now after the worries of the last few nights. She went down the narrow cottage stairs, thinking she might ask him about the animals that inhabited the woods. He'd lived in the village most of his life, so knew the area well. He was an electrician by trade. "Come in," she said, smiling, as she opened the front door. The sunlight flooded into the small hall. "It is a nice day. Are you not working?" "It's Saturday," he reminded her. "Oh, yeah," she laughed. "I'm losing track of the days here." "Camille says the same when she's home for more than a week," he said, following her into the living room. "She usually goes to the village each day to buy a paper or something as part of her routine." "I get news alerts on my phone," Jan said, and opened the living room curtains. "But you don't get the local gossip," Chris pointed out with a smile. "That's true." Chris opened the door to the kitchen and Tinder rushed to greet him, tail wagging. "He'll be wanting his breakfast," Jan said, joining Chris in the small kitchen. She picked up Tinder's food bowl and scooped in a measure of dry dog food. Chris placed the box of eggs in the fridge. He was at home here and knew where most things were from all the years he'd known Camille. Jan refreshed Tinder's water bowl and then filled the coffee machine. One thing she, Chris and Camille all had in common was their love of decent coffee. "So, is everything okay here?" Chris asked, as he always did when he visited. "Yeah, fine, thanks." "You got plenty of coins for the meter?" She told him about her scare when she'd first moved in. "Yes, I won't do that again. I keep plenty." "You can always phone me if you have a problem. You've got my mobile number." "Yeah, thanks." Camille had included Chris's contact details in her instructions, saying she should call him if she needed help with any matter in the cottage. As Jan waited for the coffee to brew, Chris wandered into the living room, thrust his hands in his trouser pockets and gazed thoughtfully through the patio windows. "The grass will need its final cut before winter," he said. "I can do it if you like." "That's kind of you, but Camille left instructions on how to work the lawnmower. I'll give it a go. The exercise will do me good." "Okay, call me if the mower won't start. It can be temperamental in damp weather." "I will, thanks." Jan poured their coffees and added milk, just a splash for Chris the way he liked it, then carried the mugs into the living room. The cottage was compact, quaint, and Camille's Royal Dalton mug suited the decor perfectly. "Thank you," Chris said, as Jan passed him his coffee. Leaving the window, he settled in his usual armchair while Jan took the sofa. The living room, like the rest of the cottage, was furnished in the style of a country cottage, with oak wood furniture, white emulsion walls and floral fabrics, giving it a tasteful but homely rustic feel, in keeping with its age. There was a few moments' silence as they sipped their coffees. Then they both spoke together. "You go first," Jan said with a laugh. "I was just going to say, Camille sends her best wishes and hopes you've been able to do some writing." "Tell her I'm fine," Jan said, slightly embarrassed. She had confided in Camille in an email that she was hoping to write a novel during her stay at the cottage, but now wished she hadn't told her. It seemed a bit of a cliché, and she hadn't produced anything except a few scribbled notes. Chris often passed on short messages from Camille, although he knew they had each other's mobile numbers and email addresses. Jan wondered if it was an excuse to visit her. Tinder, having eaten half his breakfast now, barked to be let out. It was his routine to eat a little, go for a run, then return and finish his food. Jan went to the back door and let him out. "I'll walk into the village later," she said to Chris as she returned, making conversation, "while the weather's good. I need some more milk." "Don't forget the store closes at 6 in winter," Chris reminded her. "I won't. I always make sure I'm back before it gets dark anyway." He smiled indulgently. "It's fine. I've walked along Wood Lane plenty of times in the dark." "I know, but I take the car if there's any chance of it getting dark before I'm back." He smiled again. "Nice coffee." "It's the same one Camille buys from the village store," she paused. "Chris, what animals live in the woods behind the cottage, do you know?" He stopped drinking his coffee and lowered his mug. "The usual. Why?" "I've never lived in the country before, so I don't really know what is usual." He was looking at her carefully. "Grey squirrels, rats, mice, voles, birds?" "No, I mean larger animals." "Why? Have you seen something?" he asked. "Not exactly, but Tinder hears something outside this window." Without realizing it, she had cupped her hands round her mug as if drawing warmth from it, although the cottage was heated. "Like what?" Chris asked. "I don't know, but something's been coming up to this window at night after dark when the curtains are closed. Tinder hears it and gets very agitated to be let out. Last night, I saw something disappear through the hedge at the bottom of the garden and into the woods. I don't know what it was, but it seemed quite large." She stopped. She decided not to mention that she thought it could have walked on 2 legs because she'd more or less discounted that after seeing the picture of the leaping fox. Neither was she going to say that Tinder had arrived back with cooked meat on his fur. Sitting here with Chris, in daylight, it sounded weird, as if she was becoming paranoid being alone in the cottage after dark. "Perhaps it's a fox or a badger," Chris suggested, taking another sip of his coffee. "Or it could be a dog or a cat from the village. Occasionally they get lost and stray this far, but not often." "Has Camille ever mentioned anything to you?" Jan asked. "She might have done. I really can't remember," Chris replied easily. "But it's nothing to worry about. Forest animals are hungry at this time of year. They get brave and approach houses looking for food when they wouldn't normally, especially foxes. I have to keep my chickens cooped because of them." Jan nodded. "Yes, we have foxes in the town. They've lost their fear of humans and can be seen in daylight foraging in bins. Some even go into people's homes." "But you didn't see whatever it was that came here?" Chris asked. "No. It's a pity that motion sensor light outside isn't working. It would light the patio." She nodded to the window behind her. "It stopped working some time ago," Chris said. "I don't think Camille used it. Otherwise, I would have taken a look at it for her." He drank the last of his coffee. "Would you like a refill?" Jan offered. "No, I better be going. I've got a few jobs to do." He stood and took his mug to the kitchen, placing it in the sink as he always did. "I might email Camille and ask her if I can replace the light," Jan said as she walked with Chris to the front door. "Would you be able to do it if she agrees?" "Yeah, but speak to her first. As I said, she wasn't keen before." "Okay." She watched him go and then closed the front door. It seemed slightly odd that Camille wouldn't want the sensor light working, Jan thought as she returned to the living room. If nothing else, it would show the way to the dustbin in the dark. Having tripped over a couple of times, she now waited until daylight to take out the rubbish. She wasn't sure if she should contact Camille about replacing the light. Chris hadn't been very encouraging, but it would be useful to have it working. Perhaps she could repair it herself. Jan wondered as she went into the kitchen and poured herself another coffee. There would be no harm in that, as it wouldn't cost Camille anything. She knew the basics, how to replace a bulb or fuse or spot where a wire had come loose. Her father had shown her. A loose wire could blow a fuse. It had happened to a lamp in the flat, and she'd been the one to repair it. Yes, instead of contacting Camille, she'd have a look at the sensor light first to see if she could work out what was wrong. Setting down her mug in the kitchen, Jan exchanged her slippers for shoes and opened the back door. Tinder stayed on his rug. She stepped outside and felt the fresh air. Even in daylight, she was reminded how countrified and isolated the cottage was. Bushes and trees on two sides, and a dense wood at the bottom. It was quiet, with only the occasional chirp of an unseen bird or stirring of dry leaves. Camille had said the cottage had been built around 1830. Originally a tenanted farmhouse, it retained many of its original features, although the thatched roof had been replaced by slate tiles. Jan stood on the stone patio and looked up at the sensor light. It was on the wall just above the living room window. She'd seen it before, but hadn't taken much notice. Now, as she looked, she could see it was quite new. Why install a new sensor light and not use it, she thought. That was odd. Camille must have felt she needed it, and Chris had offered to look at it to see what was wrong, but she'd refused. It didn't make sense. She couldn't see an electric cable running from the light, so logically that meant it went straight through the wall behind the light, as it did on the sensor light at her parents' house. Returning indoors, Jan took off her outdoor shoes and went upstairs. The cottage had 2 bedrooms. The main one at the front was Camille's, and she'd cleared it out so Jan could use it. The second, a smaller bedroom, was at the rear of the cottage, and Camille used it for storage. Jan had looked in when she'd first arrived, but not since. There'd been no need to. She went in. As well as a single bed, a small wardrobe and a chest of drawers, it was full of Camille's belongings, some from the main bedroom, to make space for Jan. Clothes she didn't need were in sealed polythene bags on the bed, and the storage boxes on the floor seemed to contain books, photograph albums, old CDs, DVDs, china ornaments, and other knickknacks. Jan carefully picked her way around the boxes to the window. The sensor light was just below it on the other side. However, the bed was pushed right up against the wall, so she couldn't see where the cable came in. She pulled the bed away from the wall, and the junction box came into view. She squeezed into the space between the bed and the wall. She'd need a screwdriver to take the front of the box off to get to the fuse. But then, as she looked closer, she saw the on-off switch was set to off. Surely it couldn't be that simple. She flicked it on. Could it have accidentally got switched off when the bed had been pushed against the wall to make room for the boxes? But wouldn't Camille have checked that? Jan went downstairs. The more likely explanation was that the light was broken and Camille had switched it off at source. Without bothering to change out of her slippers, Jan stepped outside and looked up at the light. She stared in amazement as the small infrared light flashed, suggesting it was working. The real test would come after dark. She'd check it as soon as the daylight faded, but now she had to go to the village shop for the milk she needed. Chapter 5. Detective Constable Beth Mays sat at her desk in the open-plan office at Coleshaw Police Station. It was Saturday, and she was doing overtime alongside a few colleagues. With no major incident currently under investigation, most of the others were at home with their families. Beth was catching up with some administration work, form filling and report writing, which was mainly done online now and stored digitally. The door to the office opened and closed behind her, and then Detective Sergeant Bert Scrivener appeared at her side. "A Mrs. Angela Slater has just telephoned in," he said, placing a report form in front of her. "Can you follow it up, please? It's probably a misunderstanding, but it needs checking ASAP as it's about a baby. Mrs. Slater says her neighbours Mr. and Mrs. Jennings had a baby, but it's disappeared, and the mother hasn't been seen for a while either. Perhaps they're staying with relatives, Beth suggested, feeling she was stating the obvious. Exactly. The PNC checks have come back negative, so neither of them has been in trouble before. There are no children registered at that address and no child protection issues. I'll leave it with you. As the DS left, Beth saved the file she'd been working on and picked up her desk phone. Drawing the report form towards her, she keyed in the telephone number for Mrs. Slater. The phone was answered after a couple of rings. Mrs. Angela Slater? Speaking. I'm Detective Constable Beth Mays. You contacted Coleshaw Police Station earlier today. Yes, I did indeed. I live at 55 Booth Lane. There's something very suspicious going on next door. Emma and Ian Jennings are the couple who live there, and they seemed very nice to begin with. Didn't make any noise and were polite when I spoke to them. She was expecting a baby, and I think she's had it, but it's disappeared. Beth could tell from the mounting excitement in her voice that Mrs. Slater enjoyed a drama. Do you know for certain your neighbour has had the baby? Beth asked as Mrs. Slater paused for breath. As certain as I can be. She told me she was going to have a home birth because they'd had a bad experience in the hospital with their previous baby. It died. She used to talk to me, but then 3 months ago she stopped. Her husband used to speak to my husband, but he began avoiding us too. I can't think of anything I said that could have upset them. I've caught glimpses of her hanging out her washing, but that's all. When's the baby due, do you know? Beth asked, making a note. Not for a few months, I thought. It must have come early. On Tuesday morning, I was looking out of my bedroom window and I saw a woman leave with a Moses basket. It was about 8 o'clock. Did you see a baby? Beth asked. No. The blanket was pulled right up over its face, which struck me as odd. I mean, I wondered if it could breathe. From the way she was carrying the Moses basket, careful-like, I'm sure there was a baby in it. Then she spent some time strapping the basket into the back of her car. If it was empty, you wouldn't bother, would you? Then, about 2 hours later, I saw her return without the baby or the basket. She was in their house for an hour. I think she's a nurse or a midwife. What makes you say that? Beth asked. When she left the second time, she was carrying a black bag, like midwives use, and an oxygen cylinder. Perhaps Ian or Emma has a lung condition? Beth suggested. Not when I used to talk to them. They were both very healthy. I remember Emma telling me she couldn't understand why she'd had such a damaged baby the first time, as she was fit and well, and had done everything right, like taking iron tablets and not drinking alcohol. I told her sometimes these things happen and it wasn't her fault. No, quite. When was the last time you saw them? I haven't seen her this week, but he has been in and out a couple of times carrying shopping. Can you give me a description of the woman you saw leaving their house with the Moses basket? Beth asked. She was around 50, I guess. About 5'6" tall, dark, chin-length hair. A bit on the dumpy side, like she could do with losing a few pounds. And the car? Beth asked as she wrote. Can you give me a description of that? It was a grey Vauxhall Corsa. The only reason I know the make and model is because my sister has one the same. I didn't get the registration, but if I see it again, I'll make a note and call you. Thank you. That would be helpful. You're welcome, Mrs. Slater said. I mean, you hear of such strange things happening. I wondered if they'd sold their baby, or maybe she was a surrogate mother. But that didn't seem to add up, as she wanted the baby. They'd even chosen a name for it, David. I suppose it could be ill and in hospital, Beth suggested. I wondered that, but wouldn't the parents be with their baby if it was sick? I'm sure Emma's at home, and he's certainly in and out. Parents who have a sick baby usually stay with them in hospital. I know I did with mine. I never left her side. Which Beth supposed was true. I'll look into it, thank you. You've been most helpful. Will you be visiting them then? Mrs. Slater asked. Yes.
What time? I'll arrange to be at home in case you need me.
That shouldn't be necessary, but thank you anyway. I have your phone number and I'll contact you if I need anything further. Beth wound up the conversation and Mrs. Slater said a reluctant goodbye. While Beth would certainly investigate the disappearance of the baby, she didn't share Mrs. Slater's enthusiasm for it being a mystery with sinister undertones. The most likely explanation was that mother and baby were in hospital after a home delivery had developed complications. She would visit Mr. and Mrs. Jennings, but first she needed to check the register of births online. Beth stayed at her computer, and a few minutes later she had the information she was looking for. The birth of David Jennings hadn't been registered, but parents had 42 days to register the birth of their baby, so there was still plenty of time. 20 minutes later, Beth parked the unmarked police car in the road outside 57 Booth Lane. There was a car on the Jennings driveway, and a small window was open on the second floor, suggesting someone could be in. All the houses in the road were built in a similar 1980s terrace style, with a driveway at the front just long enough to take a car. As Beth got out, she glanced over at number 55, where Mrs. Slater lived. There was no sign of her, but Beth noted that if she stood at her front bedroom window, she would have a good view of the Jennings drive and the road outside. It was different on the other side, number 59. Their view was obstructed by a tree. Beth went up the path of number 57, pressed the doorbell and waited. No one answered, so she pressed it again, waited some more, and then the door opened. "Mr. Ian Jennings," she said, showing her ID. He nodded. "I'm Detective Constable Beth Mays from Coleshaw CID." "Yes?" he asked somberly. "Can I come in?" "Why? Is something the matter?" "It would be better if we discussed it inside." He moved aside to let her in and closed the door. Of average height and build, Ian Jennings was dressed in blue jeans and a navy sweatshirt. His only distinguishing feature was his blonde hair. Beth followed him into the living room, which was at the front of the house and minimally furnished, with a long sofa, television and bookcase. Beth saw there was no sign of any baby equipment. "Is your wife Emma here?" Beth asked. "She's resting upstairs. She's not well." "Oh dear, I'm sorry. What's the matter with her?" Ian hesitated. "I don't mean to be rude, but why are you here?" "We've received a phone call from a worried member of the public. I understand your wife was expecting a baby?" He looked shocked. "Yes, she was, but I don't understand what that has got to do with anyone else." He was clearly struggling to contain his emotions, a mixture of anger and upset, Beth thought. "Has she had the baby?" Beth asked. "Yes, but that's our business, surely." "Where's the baby now?" "It was born dead," he said bluntly, and his eyes filled. "I'm so sorry," Beth said. "Please accept my sincere condolences." Ian nodded stiffly. "Will there be a post-mortem?" Beth asked. If the baby was full term, it was likely. "I don't know. Why? The midwife took him away. We were too distraught to deal with it. We still are." He wiped his hand over his eyes. "I am sorry," Beth said again, "but you understand we have to follow up concerns like this from the public." "Like what?" Ian asked. He hadn't suggested they sit down and continued to face Beth across the room. "If a baby is missing." "He's not missing. He's dead," Ian said tearfully. "I understand that now. If I could just go upstairs and see your wife, I'll be on my way." "Why do you want to see Emma?" "So I can say I've seen her in my report, and to give her my condolences." "Report?" Ian questioned. "It's procedure. I'll conclude my report by saying I've seen you both and close the file." "All right, this way," he said. "Sorry if I was rude. We've had a dreadful week, as you can imagine." Yes. Beth followed Ian out of the living room and upstairs to the bedroom at the front of the house. The curtains were half open, and Emma Jennings was dressed and lying on top of the bed. "It's the police," Ian said, going in first. Emma immediately looked worried and heaved herself up the pillow as Ian went protectively to her side. The poor woman looked dreadful, Beth thought, with deathly pale skin and dark circles under her eyes. Beth was struck by how much she looked like her husband. She had read that couples grew to resemble each other over time, and here was a perfect example. "I'm so sorry for your loss," Beth said. Going over, she showed Emma her ID. "I lost my baby," she said in a small, pitiful voice. "Why are you here?" "We received a call from a member of the public who thought a baby had disappeared from this house." "It has," Emma said, even more upset. "He's gone. I'll never see him again." Tears spilled onto her cheeks. "I am sorry," Beth said again. "You understand why I had to check?" "Yes." "I'll leave you then. Do you have everything you need?" Emma nodded. "Look after yourselves. I'll let myself out." Leaving Ian to comfort his distraught wife, Beth returned downstairs and left the house. She felt very sorry for the couple. Their grief was raw, but the mystery of the disappearing baby had been solved. There had been no foul play. Their baby had tragically been born dead. Of course the midwife would have covered its body with the blanket in the Moses basket while she carried it out, and then secured it on the rear seat of the car as she drove to the morgue. It was awfully sad, but it appeared no crime had been committed, and in this respect, Beth was pleased.